When the C5 Corvette was first released, it was a massive hit. People in the 90s and early 2000s couldn't even believe how fast this car was. Aside from people complaining about how big the rear end was and some other people comparing it to the RX-7, this car is pretty well accepted. Of course, now with all the advancements in technology today, it's no surprise that the C5 Corvette isn't the king of the streets anymore. So in today's video, I wanted to dive into the question, can the C5 Corvette still compete with the sports cars of today? So let's get right into it, guys. There are two main things that we need to look at to decide if the C5 Corvette is still competitive against today's sports cars. The first one being, how well does the C5 Corvette handle compared to cars of today? And the second thing that we're going to look at is the power to weight ratio. So we're going to calculate the C5 Corvette's power to weight ratio and compare it to sports cars of today. And of course, there are a ton of other factors that we could look at to see how the C5 Corvette stacks up, but these two main factors are pretty much going to tell us everything we need to know. So the first question is, how does the C5 Corvette handle? The C5 Corvette is both lightweight and balanced. This is mostly because of the transaxle design, which takes the transmission and moves it to the rear of the car and mates it up with the differential. This gives us a 50-50 weight distribution, which is optimal for handling when you're on the track. Basically what this does is it gives even weight to each tire on the car, and because of that, you have a much less likely chance of spinning out and losing control of the car. The C5 feels light and nimble on the track, but it also has a stiff chassis, so that way all of these suspension components can work more effectively. The uniframe on the C5 is actually 4 times stiffer than the C4 Corvette due to the hydroformed frame rails that were introduced during this model. Of course, the C5 Corvette is extremely outdated when it comes to steering and suspension components compared to cars of today. Obviously, cars today are a little bit heavier than the C5 Corvette, but that's mostly because of all the sensors, electronics, and computers on board that allow the suspension to be tuned on the fly and also make the car a little bit more forgiving when it comes to pushing the car to the absolute limit. Pretty much all sports cars today are going to have an edge over the C5 Corvette when it comes to track environments because the suspension is able to be more finely tuned. And although the C5 Corvette lacks this technology, a good driver may be able to make up for this lack of technology in some cases. Now the next question is, how does the power to weight ratio compare to cars of today? The LS1 engine is an absolute icon in the world of motorsports. I challenge you to find anybody in the motorsports world who has not heard of the LS engine. When it comes to Miatas, all the way up to E46s, these engines have been swapped into pretty much every car imaginable. This is mostly because of all the aftermarket support and also the fact that these engines can be taken apart and rebuilt like a Lego set. But talking stock for stock, does the LS1 still have a lot to offer as far as performance? So today I wanted to use the 1999 C5 Corvette base and the 2003 Z06 Corvette as benchmarks to see how these cars match up against sports cars of today. So as you guys can see from this table, I have the model, power, weight, and then the power to weight ratio. You guys should also note that the power is horsepower to the crank and the weight is in pounds. So starting off with the 1999 base C5, the power is 345 horsepower to the crank, and then the weight is 3,245 pounds. And now after dividing the power by the weight, we get a power to weight ratio of 0.106 horsepower per pound. Now moving on to the 2003 Z06 C5, the power that we have for this one is 405 horsepower to the crank, and the weight of this one is 3,118 pounds. So dividing the power by the weight again, we get a power to weight ratio of 0.13 horsepower per pound. As you guys saw from that table, the Z06 has more power and is lighter weight, thus making the power to weight ratio a little bit more favorable than the C5 Corvette base. For you guys' reference, the power to weight ratio is better if it's higher, but I should also mention that we are using crank horsepower numbers for this model, not wheel horsepower numbers. So there might be a little bit of discrepancies based on the efficiency of the drivetrain for each car, so just keep that in mind. So now let's start calculating the power to weight ratio of some of the sports cars on the market today. So again, for this table, we have the model, power, weight, and then the power to weight ratio. So the first one that we're going to go over today is the 2024 Toyota GR86. So as far as power, the GR86 has 228 horsepower to the crank and weighs about 2,851 pounds. This gives us a power to weight ratio of 0.08 horsepower per pound. And now comparing this number to the C5 Corvette numbers, it is pretty clear that the C5 Corvettes would win. Now next up is the 2024 Mazda MX-5. This car has 181 horsepower to the crank and weighs about 2,341 pounds, thus giving the power to weight ratio of 0.077 horsepower per pound. Again, with this number, the C5 Corvettes come out on top. Now moving up to the next bracket, we have the 2024 Chevy Camaro SS, which has a power rating of 455 horsepower to the crank and weighs about 3,800 pounds. For this one, we get a power to weight ratio of 0.12 horsepower per pound, which, as you guys can see, the base C5 Corvette is probably going to lose this race, but the Z06 has a much better chance of keeping up. Now moving on to the 2024 Ford Mustang GT, we have a power rating of 480 horsepower to the crank, and this one also weighs about 3,800 pounds and gives us a power to weight ratio of 0.126 horsepower per pound. It just barely edges over the Chevy Camaro SS, and again, we see the base C5 Corvette is going to fall short of this number, and the Z06 power to weight ratio is going to come out on top. Now moving into the big boy bracket, we have the 2024 Chevy Corvette C8. As far as power, this one has 490 horsepower to the crank, and as far as weight, we have 3,400 pounds. That gives us a power to weight ratio of 0.144 horsepower per pound. As you guys can see, the C8 Corvette is going to absolutely demolish both of our C5 Corvettes. And now finally, we have the 2024 BMW M5, which comes out at 718 horsepower to the crank and weighs a whopping 5,368 pounds. This gives us a power to weight ratio of 0.134 horsepower per pound, which is less than the C8 Corvette, but it's still going to stomp our C5 Corvettes. Now, after reviewing the data, are we really surprised that this happened to the C5 Corvette? Probably not. I mean, come on guys, it's a car from the 90s, so the fact that it did this good is actually pretty surprising. So long story short, if you have a base C5 Corvette, you're going to be walking GR86s and Miatas all day long, but you're probably going to get stomped by Mustang GTs and Camaro SSs. But on the other hand, if you have a stock Z06, you're probably going to be able to keep up with the Mustang GTs and Camaro SSs, but when it comes to the C8 Corvette and the M5s, you're still going to get bus lengths. And guys, this is just the data. These are the numbers. If you want to get mad at somebody, get mad at the numbers. Don't get mad at me. But before you guys get too upset, I wanted to share with you guys some of the ways to get your car up to speed, because there are a ton of ways to squeeze more power out of your LS1 and LS6 engines. For better handling, it really depends on what kind of racing you'll be doing, but a few good suspension upgrades include stiffer sway bars, better transverse leaf springs or a good set of coilovers, adjustable shocks, and new urethane bushings. These are all great ways to make your C5 Corvette handle the corners better, but these don't mean anything if you're still getting smoked on the straightaways. So here's some ways to get your power to weight ratio to the next level. Some of the best power adders for the C5 Corvette are performance cam, long tube headers, intake manifolds, upgraded heads, supercharger or turbochargers, and of course a dyno tune. These are just the best bang for your buck power adders for your LS1 and LS6 engines, but just a quick Google search will tell you that there are pretty much unlimited options when it comes to adding power to your LS. If you do a performance cam, long tube headers, upgraded intake manifold, upgraded heads, and a dyno tune, you can expect to see 400 to 450 wheel horsepower on a base model C5. Using a rough guesstimate, this will be equal to about 460 to 520 crank horsepower based on the average 15% power loss through the drivetrain. And of course, we can do the reverse calculation of the power to weight ratio to figure out how much crank horsepower you need to make to be competitive with a C8 Corvette. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the power to weight ratio from the C8 Corvette, which is about 0.144 horsepower per pound, and then we're going to multiply it by the weight of the C5 Corvette base model. This is going to give us 0.144 times 3,245, and that's going to equal 467.28 crank horsepower. Now, using that 15% estimate for drivetrain power loss, we're going to multiply that 467.28 horsepower number by 0.85, which is going to give us 397.2 rear wheel horsepower. So basically that means that my 1999 C5 Corvette needs to put down a number of 397.2 rear wheel horsepower on the dyno for it to be competitive against a C8 Corvette. Although, of course, I drive a manual transmission, so it's going to be pretty hard for me to outshift the C8's automatic transmission because those things are deadly fast. But for us to have the exact same power to weight ratio, that's the number I need to make. So as you guys can see from that quick example, it's actually really easy to make the C5 Corvette competitive in today's market. And of course, when you start adding things like forced induction, these cars can make a ton of power and you'll pretty much whoop anything on the street. But there you have it, guys. That's how the C5 Corvette matches up against sports cars of today. If your C5 Corvette has modifications done to it, calculate your power to weight ratio and put it in the comments below. But if you enjoyed the content for today, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because subscribing to Mile High Misfits is the best way to support the channel, and we would greatly appreciate it. But that's all for this week, guys. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Later.